just sat there, and you pulled the trigger. You didn't see the threat. You saw a black man walking a dog, and that was enough to kill. You think you have the right? You just executed a four-legged combat-trained operative. Now welcome to hell. From this moment on, you are no longer police. You are two bleeding careers waiting to be buried on paper. Twilight fell, and the last sunlight filtered through low branches hanging over the sidewalk, casting warped shadows across the street. The neighborhood was silent, as if forgotten, where rusted house numbers and chipped white fences were the only things separating those who had lived there from those merely passing by. Reuben Shaw walked steadily, unhurried, one hand relaxed at his side, the other holding a light grip on a canvas leash. There was no collar, yet the dog stayed perfectly in position at his left side, not drifting even half a step. The Malinois moved in silence, its muscular frame reflecting a discipline that required no command. It was a form of wordless commitment between two beings who had been through fire. The white police SUV appeared suddenly, braking hard at the edge of the curb, kicking up a cloud of dust from the roadside. The door flew open, and a young officer jumped out as if responding to a level 1 pursuit. His right hand landed immediately on the grip of his gun, his voice raised and urgently strained. "Hold that dog, you stray." Reuben stopped walking. He didn't tilt his head, he didn't show resistance. He only turned his face slightly, eyes locking directly between the furrowed brows of the officer. His voice was low, each word distinct. "Are you threatening me or my animal?" There was a pause, just 1 second, then the other officer, older, stepping out from the driver's seat with rolled-up sleeves and a chest spilling out of his bulletproof vest, laughed shortly, as if this kind of moment was routine. "They train dogs with violence. Shoot first." The words landed like a stomp in the space that had not yet collapsed. The air shifted. Something cracked in the silence. The Malinois didn't move. Reuben didn't need to pull the leash or speak. But the two officers didn't look at the stillness. They saw muscle, dark brown fur, a shadow stretched tight to the pavement, and that was enough to trigger something. What they didn't see was what had been forged through bombs and bullets. They only saw what made them afraid. A black man walking a dog that looked too well trained. The young officer tightened his grip on the gun. Reuben remained still. The older officer's veins flared at his neck. He growled, "I said hold the dog. Don't test me." At that moment, Reuben bent down, not rushed, not alarmed. His right hand flicked slightly behind, fingers curling in a near-invisible motion. The Malinois sat instantly, perfect posture, head high, eyes forward, not a single growl. But that obedience confused the young officer. His finger twitched. The gun was no longer a tool. It was a chain reaction, and that reaction was set off by the control Reuben had just shown. The crack of the taser echoed sharply, and a jet of gas hissed out in a cruel arc. It hit the Malinois square in the face as it sat. The dog jolted as if doused with boiling water, eyes wide, releasing a howl that tore from its throat. The cry was cut short by the heavy fall as it collapsed to one side, legs twitching, foam spilling from its mouth. There was no blood, but the burnt stink of fur and flesh turned the whole front yard rancid. Reuben stepped forward 3 steps. Not fast, not slow. He knelt beside the dog, hand resting on its chest. 1 second, then 2, then 3. People started pouring out from windows, from the shop across the street, from parked cars. A woman gasped, "Oh God, they shot a sitting dog!" A boy around 10 years old pulled out his phone, his hand shaking as he hit record. The older officer approached, his face flushed red. "Stand up. You're violating animal control and obstructing law enforcement." Reuben didn't respond. His left hand gently stroked the dog's neck, now completely still. The dog's eyes were half open, pupils dilated, one side of its mouth leaking thick, dark red fluid. He whispered something into its ear. Almost no one heard it. They only saw his fingers gripping the leash that had once connected them and holding tight. "Who do you think you are?" the younger officer said, his voice pitched higher than necessary. "Some stray dog walker threatening cops in broad daylight?" Reuben slowly lifted his head. His face had hardened like a whetstone. "It was trained not to react to stupidity. I'm not sure you were taught the same." The air froze. The older officer stepped in, voice sharp. "We have the right to protect this neighborhood, and that thing," he pointed at the dog's body, "could have been a threat," Reuben repeated, deeper, lower. "You're calling a creature that was sitting still a threat?" "Enough!" the officer yelled. "What's your name?" Reuben exhaled. He placed his hand on the dog's head, smoothing it across the forehead one last time. "I used to carry that name into night missions, but it seems you don't deserve to know it." He pulled a small piece of metal from inside his coat, a worn identification tag, the letters faded, edges chipped, steel rim rusted. He placed it on the pavement by his foot. "Pick it up and read it, but when you're done, get ready to call a lawyer." A woman, standing by her doorway, cried out, "I know him. That's Reuben Shaw. He was in Iraq. That dog saved children in a bombing in Fallujah." No one moved. The younger officer stepped back. The older one clenched his jaw. "I don't care who you are. Around here, we have the authority to control this area." Reuben stood up. His eyes were no longer just a stare. They were a sentence. He bent down, took back the tag, wiped it clean, looked straight at both of them. "You think wearing a uniform makes you strong. I've seen men with badges who wouldn't walk through a door, but you think killing a dog proves power." His voice turned cold. "You just shot a soldier without a gun, a teammate without a mouth to argue, and now you'll learn what a real reaction looks like." The young officer whispered, I didn't know." Reuben stepped forward. "Not knowing won't save you. You didn't kill a dog, you just opened a door you don't know how to close." A girl's voice rose behind him. "What was its name, mister?" Reuben lowered his head, not turning around. "It used to be called Echo." Then he looked at the two officers. "And you just silenced Echo forever. But the echo from this will not go away." He turned and walked, the canvas leash still in his hand, a small drop of blood touching the pavement like a mark no one could erase. And from now on, no one would control the story that had just begun. Not with a badge, not with a gun, not with orders, and certainly not with silence. Reuben's shadow stretched across the last sliver of sunlight left on the street. The air in the neighborhood thickened suddenly, as if someone had sealed off every gap where wind could pass. He raised his left hand slightly. No need to look. A small gesture, but the Malinois sat immediately. Its posture was squared, as if rehearsed. Shoulders tight, head lifted from the ground, its eyes locked onto the officer, not aggressive, not startled, simply in place. The pepper spray burst out in the same instant. No warning, no pause. The young officer pulled the trigger like he was ending a game he feared he was about to lose. The stream of compressed gas shot straight at the dog's face, slicing through the air like an invisible blade. The dog jolted violently, feet slipping backward, howling in a sharp, piercing pitch. One of its eyes clouded almost instantly. Its teeth clicked together in a dry snap. Then its strong body crumpled to the side like a collapsed weight. The crowd had no time to react before a voice tore through the air. "You shot the dog while it was sitting?" The sound didn't come from any one person, but echoed from all directions, like it had bounced off the heat-scorched walls. A woman grabbed her child's shoulder, pulling him back. An old man raised his phone, his hand trembling, eyes locked on the scene. The two officers kept moving forward, not slowing. Eyes tense and tinged with confusion. They tried to act as if it were a routine check, as if what they had done was necessary, but the eyes around them no longer belonged to bystanders. They were the eyes of judgment, quiet, restrained, ready to ignite. Reuben said nothing, no yelling, no outburst like other men might have made in such a moment. He stepped forward, knelt beside Echo, with the care of someone bowing before something sacred. His hand pressed gently to the dog's neck, slipping under the furs ill-warm. The heartbeat was too faint. Its ear twitched. A thin red line leaked from the corner of its jaw, then dripped, one drop at a time, down onto cracked concrete. Like a clock that no longer told time, only counted slow deaths. The older officer stopped 2 meters away, eyes narrowed. "I told you to restrain the dog. You ignored orders. We followed protocol." Reuben didn't raise his head. His hand remained on the dog's neck, palm soaked in blood, damp, metallic, but steady. He pressed his forehead to Echo's, whispering without sound. No one heard. No one stepped in. The air had frozen. The young officer began to stagger back a step. His face turned pale, not from blood, but from the silence, heavier than the shot. Each stroke along Echo's back felt like a slap across the still young mind that had just caused a death it wasn't prepared to face. A woman in the crowd hissed, "It was sitting still. You killed it for doing nothing." A brown-skinned man pushed a stroller off the street. Voice weighted like stone. "This is what you call protecting the community?" Reuben looked up. His eyes were red but dry. His face showed no anger, but the calm had vanished. It was the expression of someone who had watched a teammate get shot in the back and still had to keep moving. "I don't need anyone to pity him," he said, just loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. He wasn't trained to be pitied. He was trained to keep an entire unit still when the bomb hadn't gone off yet. And you just destroyed that with a trigger pull. He stood up. His left hand gripped the canvas leash ash, now stained with blood. His right hand supported the dog's head, setting it down on the cement as gently as if placing someone into an open coffin. The older officer frowned. "Who do you think you are, talking to police like that?" Reuben turned, eyes locked on him. "I led a unit into Fallujah. Echo was the only one who made it out besides me. When you killed him, you fired into a discipline you've never understood." The officer didn't answer. He turned to the other. "Get his ID. We're writing this up." Reuben laughed. A short, low sound, like a blade sliding across a throat. "You want to file a report on a creature that just died in the middle of performing its duty of loyalty?" The younger officer stammered. I didn't know it was a service dog. I just thought it was dangerous. Because it was big? Or because it was black?" Reuben said, his voice now low, dense, and forged like steel in cold water. "Or was it because I was the one walking it? If it had been a white woman in a dress with a Labrador, would you have nodded politely?" No one answered. No one drew a weapon. No one could still pretend this was a civil conversation. A man from the crowd stepped forward. "I used to be in a K-9 unit. I know the way Echo sat, the way it responded. I know that look. That wasn't an attack dog. That was a soldier." Reuben looked at him. "Your name?" "Grady, Recon, Unit 45. Reuben nodded. "Real soldiers recognize each other." Then he turned to the two officers. "Carrying a gun doesn't mean you're fighting for anything." At that moment, a little girl slipped out from the crowd, holding a white cloth. She offered it to Reuben. "I didn't know what else to do." Her voice was clear, not knowing right from wrong, only pain. Reuben took it, gently wiping Echo's mouth, not to clean the blood, but to cover its eyes, so it wouldn't have to see any more of human foolishness. The girl asked, "What was his name?" Reuben whispered, "Echo." She repeated the name like it was a password to a place adults could never reach. The sound of a helicopter rumbled in the distance above. Police were calling for backup. The more people who arrived, the less anyone could undo the first shot. Reuben stood at the intersection, one hand holding the torn collar, the other gripping the small steel tag, the one once tied to Echo's neck during covert missions. The saunter slowed and stopped blinking. He stepped off the street and onto the curb, slowly. The crowd parted, not out of fear, but sensing that something had moved beyond the reach of the law. Reuben stopped, spoke one last time before disappearing from the camera's view. "I won't sue, I won't respond the way you're used to. But from now on, every echo that rings out will remind people how you handled a creature that only knew how to sit still." The crowd hadn't dispersed, but the voices had died down to a low murmur, clinging to the air like dust that hadn't yet settled after an explosion. Reuben still knelt beside Echo, his hand resting on the animal's head, fingers no longer pressing but holding as if trying to reverse the flow of blood, though he knew there was nothing left to hold on to. The Malinois' body had stopped convulsing. His breath faded slowly, then disappeared entirely in silence, like someone long used to retreating without making a sound. The older police officer yanked the radio from his belt, but instead of calling for backup, he turned to Reuben and shouted, voice straining to drown out what had just happened, "You were handling that dog off leash. You violated animal control laws." Reuben didn't answer. His body was nearly still, but there was no trace of surrender or defeat. His right hand remained on Echo's head, gentle, firm, like a private farewell well between two comrades who'd once known how to breathe together through minefield smoke. He tilted his head, leaning down slightly, voice low but unwavering. "You made it through many fire zones. I'm sorry this one was worse." No one in the crowd dared to step in. Each witness could tell the apology wasn't for anyone but Echo, a cold acknowledgement that not every battlefield comes with a list of targets, and in places like this, the most loyal often die first. The younger officer, standing just to Reuben's right, who hadn't spoken until now, suddenly reached for the grip of his gun again. His thumb trembled, unsure whether it was from tension or the dawning realization that he had already gone too far. His eyes were fixed on the dog's body. "Why didn't it bite?" he asked, voice noticeably lower. Was it trained? Reuben didn't turn. He only lifted his head. His eyes gleamed dark bronze, sharp and cold, but not angry. It was the look seen through a scope, in the dark, from someone who knew he wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger. His voice rang out, each word hard as a nail driven into steel. It was trained not to respond to stupidity. "Who trained you?" The question wasn't sarcasm. It was a sentence. No emotion, no raised voice. Yet everyone present felt it strike dead center between the eyes like the butt of a heavy rifle. The young officer stepped half a foot back, his hand dropping from the gun, his dazed eyes flicking around as if searching for someone to stand between him and the truth just flung in his face. The older officer still tried to posture with authority, but it was the silence of the man before him that unraveled him. "Who do you think you are? Lecturing the police," he growled. "You think you can walk an animal like that through a neighborhood, no leash, no muzzle, and not face consequences?" Reuben stood, not abruptly, not with a shrug, not puffing himself up. He simply stood, and that alone stretched the air tight, like a steel wire between two towers, so tense that if anyone breathed too hard, the whole system might snap. "I think," he said, "if a creature knows how to sit still with a gun pointed at it, the first thing someone called a police officer should do is ask a question, not pull a trigger." A woman in the crowd covered her mouth. She was crying, filming. Something in that sentence made people feel ashamed, on behalf of every time they'd stayed silent when they should have stood. The older officer scoffed, but his mouth twisted. "Please, don't use fancy words to justify letting a dog loose in public. Around here, everyone knows a dangerous dog is a weapon." Reuben looked straight at him, gaze unwavering. "What's dangerous? What's gentle? What deserves a bullet? Who taught you to answer those questions? The academy or your instincts?" There was no reply, but that silence was the clearest confession. A white man in the crowd spoke up. "I've lived here 10 years. He walks that dog every day, never caused trouble. Everyone here knows it. Don't act." A boy about 10 squeezed forward, holding out a phone. "I got a video. The dog sat, then they shot." He looked at the young officer, not angry, but truly confused. "Why did you do that?" The young officer lowered his head. He didn't answer. Reuben didn't touch anyone. He bent down, unfastened the fabric strap from Echo's neck, folded it, and slipped it into his chest pocket, like folding a flag over a casket. No medals needed, no ceremonial music, just a kind of burial on the pavement. The older officer shouted one last time, "We're filing charges! You stay here! Show ID!" Reuben looked at him, perfectly calm. "My ID is in every scar your system never saw. If you want proof, call the Pentagon. File number, Reuben Shaw, Delta Unit." A chill moved through the crowd. The veterans present began looking at each other. A woman took a photo, her hands shaking. Another pulled out her phone, typing into Google right away, and the first results that popped up were enough to shut down anyone trying to claim Reuben was just being uncooperative. In the fading evening light, Reuben walked away from the scene, leaving behind a group of people unsure how to apologize. A dog's body no one dared touch, and a hole in society's understanding that no news report could fill with a few words like, "under further investigation." The street, once empty, was now packed with faces. They hadn't come out of curiosity, but because they felt they were witnessing something that would appear on the news tomorrow and might be told wrong. They stayed silent, not out of fear, but because what had just happened was beyond outrage. Some stood at second-story windows, others leaned behind bougainvillea fences next door, and a few held phones without remembering to hit record. A middle-aged woman stepped fully into the street, phone held straight up, lens pointed at Reuben. Her voice trembled slightly but was firm. "This is Reuben Shaw. I've seen him here many times, he and the dog. They never caused trouble. He lives 2 blocks from here." She turned the camera toward the police. "They shot the dog while it was sitting still. Can someone explain that?" Reuben stood. The motion was nothing dramatic, yet time seemed to hesitate in the moment he lifted himself from the ground. His body rose upright, not bracing on anything, no assistance needed. The dark clothes draped over his frame formed a shape almost perfectly still. On his shirt, sweat had soaked into a faint triangle at the center of his left chest, a kind of muscle memory printed from hundreds of times wearing body armor. He didn't adjust anything, didn't brush off the dust. He simply stood, and that standing tightened the woman's live stream frame, as if even the camera had to back off a little. The young officer turned his face away. The older one lowered his voice, but kept the edge in his tone. "What are you staring at? Drop the act." Reuben faced them, eyes neither raised nor lowered, only level, like a line no one was allowed to cross. "I'm burying a teammate," he said, every word clear and steady, "and you're digging your own graves." No one in the crowd spoke. No one stepped in. Not a single clap. But no one walked away, either. A young man in the crowd blurted out, "I know that triangle. You were Special Forces, weren't you?" The woman filming moved the camera closer. On the screen appeared a black man standing in the sun, next to a dog's body, and a faint triangle in the sweat stain. A symbol that couldn't be bought, couldn't be faked, and couldn't be explained away with a job title. The older officer scoffed, one hand on his hip, the other pointing at the woman's phone. "Turn that off. You're recording illegally." She shot back, voice firm, "I'm standing on my own property. I have the right to film. Do you have a warrant to kill a dog?" Reuben kept his gaze forward. He didn't step in, didn't pull the limbs toward himself. He let the truth do its work. No directing required. But each time he shifted slightly or glanced at Echo again, the camera followed him on its own. Not because he sought attention, but because his gaze carried its own gravity. A child stepped forward, clutching her mother's shirt. "I'm scared." Her mother leaned down and whispered, not to comfort, just softly said, "Being scared is good, because you just saw something right get treated wrong. People need that feeling to know which side to stand on." On a rooftop in the distance, someone was flying a drone, adjusting its height while live streaming. The overhead shot showed Reuben and Echo forming a perfect L shape between the 2 officers, as if someone had arranged this formation long ago, just waiting for the moment to press record. The young officer stepped back again. His eyes darted around, no longer searching for backup from his partner, but trying to figure out which lenses weren't yet pointed at him. He pulled his collar up to shield his face. The older officer still tried to keep an aggressive stance. "What do you want, huh? Want to be a hero? Standing there with a dead dog, thinking you're right?" Reuben shook his head. "I just wanted silence. But you forced me to speak." He stepped one pace closer. "And when someone like me speaks, it means everything you've ever called procedure is about to be rewritten." The woman live streaming turned the camera to face herself. Hasn't yelled, hasn't hit, hasn't resisted, and still made 2 cops step back. She pointed the lens back at Reuben. "This is why we need cameras. Because not everyone carries medals to be believed." A local news reporter pushed through the crowd, press badge raised. "What's your name?" Reuben didn't turn around. He simply pulled a small metal tag from his shirt pocket, held it in his palm, and opened it. A block of dull steel, beveled edges, worn finish, just enough to reveal 4 faintly etched words. "Delta Force, 7H. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The drone operator nodded. "That's enough. This footage, the whole country will know who he is." Reuben knelt again, placed his hand on Echo's chest. This time, he didn't stroke. He just left it there. For a few seconds, everyone held their breath, not out of grief, but from witnessing a kind of reverence no ordinary person knows how to name. A young man whispered to his friend, "I used to think silence is complicity, but maybe some people stay silent because their voice is too loud." Reuben stood, eyes scanning the crowd, stopping on a child holding a hand-lettered white cardboard sign. "A good dog died here." He nodded slightly. slightly. No smile, and no thank you, but the nod made the boy clutch the sign to his chest like he'd just been knighted. The lights of a second patrol car began to flash at the end of the block. The older officer raised his radio to call it in. Reuben didn't wait. He walked across the street, leaving space between himself and the two officers, as if drawing a boundary that needed no tape. "Where are you going?" the officer asked. "To bury my teammate," Reuben answered, "and when I'm done, I'll come back. Not for revenge, but to reclaim the way you ought to look at yourselves." Reuben stood in the middle of the crowd like a concrete pillar placed in the wrong spot, too solid for anyone to move. The last light of the day stretched across his shoulder, catching the triangle-shaped sweat mark on his chest like an old insignia still clinging to coarse fabric. Eyes watched, cameras kept recording, but he didn't look at anyone. He looked at his own hands. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small object the size of a palm, and placed it in front of his chest. The brass tag was dull, one corner broken as if it had been through a serious impact. No decorations, no patterns, just one line of sunken text, not bold, not polished. D-Force, Commander, Class 7H. No one in the crowd spoke right away. It was as if everyone was silently rereading it in their minds, afraid they had misread. Those who had served in the military recognized that silence is not a performance, but a kind of reserved truth that shouldn't have to be spoken, yet must be known. The young officer stammered, not out of fear of being caught, but because the truth in front of him felt like a code beyond his ability to process. "Delta, that's the real unit?" Reuben didn't respond. He didn't need to. He looked at them for a moment, then took one step closer, just enough for both officers to feel the air around him shift. He held out the tag, not to boast, but to let them see that what they had disrespected wasn't just a dog, but a chapter in wartime history they had never served long enough to study. Then, without warning, he let the tag fall to the ground. The sound of metal hitting concrete was dry, not loud. It landed like something that had been held too long, finally giving in. Reuben didn't bend to pick it up. He left it there, right at the feet of the two men who had just made a national emblem bow its head, he said. Eyes locked on them. "You just killed a team member who was unarmed, non-resistant, and never left their position. One who saved 3 soldiers in Mosul by charging into live fire, a creature who once received a folded flag and came home in a zinc box. And you treated him like roadside trash." The crowd stopped breathing. The live stream shook, its frame askew. Someone pulled their child back as if afraid the space around Reuben might detonate. But no explosion came. Only the sound of truth landing on concrete, heavier than any siren ever could be. Reuben bent down to pick up the tag. He dusted it off as if clearing dirt from honor, then looked at both officers in turn. His face showed no anger, but that absence of anger made the air thicker than any curse. "Delta Force isn't allowed to show off," he said. "We don't make the news. We don't wear stripes. We don't ask for medals. But we remember every face that disrespected the silence of our own." The older officer inhaled deeply, but couldn't speak. The younger one lowered his head. The crowd kept holding their phones, but no one dared comment. Something had shifted. This was no longer a civilian incident, but a collision between two value systems. One backed by legal force, the other by a kind of honor no one can grant. Reuben turned his back, but he stopped before stepping out of their line of sight. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't fast, wasn't filled with rage, but it rang out like a sentence being read before the gavel drops. "You're both dead men." No one reacted immediately. No curses, no hurried footsteps, not even resistance. But the words rang out like a gunshot with no sound. One was hit right away, but everyone knew. The damage had already been set in motion. Then he added, still without turning around, "Not in the sense that'll kill you, in the sense that this society doesn't forgive. You just chose the ending to your own reputations, and no one in this system is going to carry that for you." A camera shutter clicked from across the street. The person taking the photo didn't laugh, didn't comment. He simply sent the image to a group called Whistle Watch. The photo showed Reuben standing beside Echo's body, the brass tag lying at the feet of the two officers. No caption needed. The story was no longer about a dog being killed. It had become a test of ethics between a man who had once held the lives of his teammates in his hands and those who held guns without holding memory. Everything had been recorded, and from that moment forward, no one in the frame would have the right to retreat without being asked, "Where were you standing when the truth was dragged by the neck and shot in the face?" Reuben didn't turn around again, but he knew from the moment the tag hit the ground, from the moment the identity was revealed like a card the other side didn't want to see, the old game of power had ended, and the new rules, written in blood, in silence, in duty, that no one had to command, had just begun. 12 seconds. That was all it took to completely shift public opinion. The clip was trimmed clean, no added effects, no music. It opened with a piercing scream. "You shot the dog while it was sitting?" A woman's voice from the crowd, landing like a punch to the eardrum. Then the image smoothly cut to Reuben, his eyes lifted, his face calm, to the point of being chilling. No yelling, no panic, no rage, just a gaze straight through the lens, and straight through those who had pulled the trigger. In the first 2 hours, the video was reshared over 10,000 times. No one needed context. No one asked what led up to it. That one look, the way he raised his head, was enough to make thousands stop scrolling and hold their breath. On X, the top-pushed comment by the algorithm was a short line. "He didn't shout, didn't hit, and still gave me chills." Someone quoted it and added, "Why I still believe in human will. Sometimes it doesn't take volume, just the right look at the right time." On TikTok, the clip was subtitled, "You shot a dog that sat still, and now the man doesn't even need to move." Another version was simply titled, 12 seconds, no mercy, no scream, and still climbed trending charts in less than half a day. Breakdowns were reposted. The camera tilt exactly 27 degrees, the sunlight catching the sweat mark, forming a chest triangle. The Delta Force emblem accidentally revealed. An anonymous account reposted, "He doesn't need to speak loudly, because every word he says becomes the last thing stuck in the heads of those who think they have the right." That tweet was picked up by a journalist who covers the military and instantly went viral. That night, a forum for American veterans featured a post from a user named Jayhawk_7. "I know him, Reuben Shaw. Delta soldier, Class 7H, former lead K-9 trainer at Fort Bragg. I sent him my first Malinois to train before the Syria op. He's the only man who's ever silenced me with a stare, and I was a captain." The comments below formed a long thread of military ranks, deployment orders, even black and white photos of Echo in service, wearing goggles and soft armor, sitting beside Reuben in a training compound. One person wrote, "That dog wasn't a pet, he was a soldier, and he died like one on command, holding his position, no retreat." At the same time, the hashtag "Wrong Dog, Wrong Man" began spreading. It started with a few dozen users mocking police conduct, then exploded into a symbol. Sketches of Echo in a combat helmet, images of Reuben standing beside the shadow of a dog with an ID tag, shirts printed in bold white on black. "He sat. They fired. We won't forget." Within 24 hours, veteran communities began circulating another clip, shorter, without dialogue. Just Reuben sitting beside Echo, his hand resting on the dog's neck, then bowing his head like in a ritual. Below the video, a simple white line read, "He buried him in silence. We'll bury the system with truth." Local police were soon hunted for names. Both officers were identified just hours later. Their old posts were dug up. Hunting photos, comments mocking black people, a selfie in front of a patrol car with the caption, "Make 'em bark or go down." The internet didn't need more reason. The police department's response was a brief statement. "We are investigating the incident." But the announcement did nothing to cool the anger. A civil rights lawyer wrote, "An investigation isn't necessary when the witness is a camera and the shot rang out in the street." A university professor posted, "Some deaths make people forget. Some deaths make them remember every typo in the apology letter." The woman who live-streamed the first clip spoke online. "I didn't know he was military. I just know that from the moment he looked up, I couldn't see those two as cops anymore." Reuben said nothing. He didn't appear, didn't speak to the press, didn't post on social media, but his absence only pushed the viral effect deeper. A writer posted, "People are used to someone getting angry and shouting, but when someone stays silent and still makes the whole system back down, that's something no algorithm can explain." At a high school up north, students gave a presentation titled, "Why Did Echo Sit?" The teacher was stunned when the entire class stood and said in unison, "Because it was a command, and because some creatures are more loyal than humans." After class, one student wrote on the whiteboard, "We bark when we're scared," but Echo sat because he was taught not to react to small minds. On TikTok, another viral video compared Reuben's gaze to a similar frame from a famous movie with the caption, "He's not a character, he's the man movies try to copy." Viewers didn't need to know how many times Reuben had held a gun or how many nights he had lain in ambush. All they needed was that look that silenced everyone. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need to hit, he didn't need to argue, and it was precisely because he did nothing that people felt compelled to do something in his place. No sound was needed, no subtitles, no introduction. The photo began to spread around 3 a.m. Eastern Time, lit by the faint glow of phones checked one last time before sleep. But once people saw it, they couldn't sleep anymore. The image showed Reuben sitting beside Echo, a black man, a dead Malinois, and a shaft of light falling from the corner of the house, as if it hadn't come from the sun, but from somewhere else entirely. A kind of light no one turned on, but no one dared to turn off. The two of them were framed in a scene that gave no indication of being a ceremony, yet every pixel smelled like a funeral. There was no national flag draped over the body, no brass instruments. No one is reading a eulogy, but somehow people understood this was a funeral, a kind of loss that needed no certificate or casualty list to confirm. A freelance journalist, once a war photographer, shared the photo with a short caption, "Some funerals need no drums, just a bowed head." Within hours, the line was printed on posters. People pasted them at train stations, street corners, right outside the police precinct, where the two officers involved had worked every day. A college student printed the image on a shirt and walked past groups of officers in silence. No signs, no slogans, but every head turned. That morning, a national news station aired the 12-second clip that had exploded across social media. But this time, it wasn't a user repost. It played in full screen, cutting precisely to the moment Reuben looked up. That gaze, in silence, sliding straight into the living rooms of millions. The anchor AA, a middle-aged woman known for staying composed through political coverage, paused for the first time, her voice shaking as she read, "He once commanded in Mosul. The dog's name was Echo, a unit awarded distinction during a 2016 raid. He was brought home in a steel box, but never received a medal because the unit was not allowed to exist on paper." That sentence made the studio go silent, as if someone had cut the sound. The camera shifted scenes, but viewers didn't change the channel. At the same time, animal rights groups began speaking out, but this time they weren't talking about pets. They were talking about honor, about duty, about the right to live in service and not be labeled a threat in death. One activist wrote on their blog, "We used to think dogs needed protection from abuse, but Echo wasn't abused, he was executed, and that's something the law isn't ready to face." Outside the police precinct, the crowd slowly gathered. No one chanted at first. They brought photos of Echo. They carried handwritten signs. They wore shirts with faint triangles printed over the chest. They didn't need megaphones. They didn't follow protest protocols, but when the numbers passed 100, then 1,000, someone finally raised their voice. He didn't grow, and they shot him. The chant didn't rise like a political slogan. It landed like the shortest indictment in protest history. Others repeated it. It became a rhythm, then a wave, a form of anger that didn't smash windows, didn't torch cars, but could burn down an entire system with nothing but a look. One person took the mic, no speaker needed, and said as if reminding everyone, "That dog didn't do anything, it sat and was killed, and you think you'll get past this with a press conference?" Reuben wasn't there. He didn't need to be. Photos of him sitting beside Echo, hand resting on the dog, were clipped, duplicated, and posted everywhere, from phone screens to posters pinned in VA hospital waiting rooms. People didn't stare because he was special. They stared because they couldn't look away, a kind of image that made people confront the cowardice of every time they had stayed silent over something smaller but still wrong. A law student commented, "This is no longer about animal rights. This is about the nature of authorized violence." A former judge reposted it, adding, "When police can't tell the difference between a creature following orders and a reason to fire, the system has chosen the wrong profession." The National Veterans Association, rarely involved in local events, issued a rare statement. Reuben Shaw is a legend in the special operations community. He doesn't speak often because what he's seen wasn't made for words, but when he's forced to speak, the entire country should shut up and listen. A philosophy professor wrote, "We used to think funerals needed somber music, coffins, eulogies, but some funerals begin with a single look, and no one has the right to walk away from that look without asking themselves who they really are." People began placing flowers at the wall of the police station. No names on the cards, just handwritten notes. For Echo. A young boy placed a dog bone treat, still wrapped in plastic, as if afraid someone might think Echo hadn't gotten his last meal. That morning, someone painted a message across the wall. Echo was loyal. Who betrayed whom? Below it, the image of a dog sitting, expressionless, no leash, just open eyes, exactly like at the end. And beside him, a man not in uniform, not holding a flag, not raising his head. He simply bent down, as if sending someone home to a place that once had meaning. Morning in Washington, D.C. began like any other. Sunlight filtering through roller blinds, government vehicles parked silently in front of white stone buildings, staff walking in with clipped ID badges and weak coffee. But inside the Joint Military Command, in an unnamed conference room, a 3-star general stared at a screen, and no one dared ask what he was thinking. Arms crossed, his face marked by age but eyes still sharp as they had been in the field, a young officer beside him cautiously placed a file on the table, his voice low, as if afraid the sound might trigger something long held in. "Who issued a Class 7 H tag to a black man who lives off the grid like this?" There was no answer, but the question didn't vanish. It hung in the air like lead dust that hadn't settled after shelling. Everyone in that room knew Delta Force didn't issue tags based on skin color. They issued tags based on who survived missions no one spoke of. And Reuben Shaw, a name once quietly archived, now being read aloud across the country, was one they had believed marked closed. At the Pentagon, a special investigator was assigned immediately. No press conference, no signed orders, no paper trail. The man with the slim briefcase landed as a domestic tourist, then disappeared into an unmarked SUV. The driver asked, "What approach are we taking?" He flipped through the file, glanced at the photo of Reuben sitting beside Echo, then closed it. "We're not handling a civilian case," he said, voice hard like steel scraping stone. "We're containing a chain reaction detonation." That wasn't a metaphor. It was the diagnosis of someone who had seen how one wrongful death could force a system to restructure itself. With Reuben, the question was no longer, why was the dog shot? But why can't the system face a man who's died and come back hundreds of times for this country? On national news, Fox quoted internal sources, "Delta Force has made no statements, but they are watching." The line aired alongside images of crowds outside the police station, people wearing shirts with Echo's image, children holding hand-drawn signs, veterans standing guard on either side like a barricade that didn't need wire. Some security experts began reanalyzing video of Reuben, his hand movements, his gaze, how he walked, how he never raised his voice. So, Delta Force was banned. "He took a wire-climbing wall," he said. A strategic psychologist wrote, "No one learns to move like that unless they've survived what others didn't." Another said it more plainly. Reuben didn't start a war. He's what happens when people who've never seen war make all the rules. Social media kept boiling, but this time not just with emotion. A philosophy professor reposted a line Reuben had once spoken, now turned into a meme printed on mugs, shirts, and posters. "If it had teeth, it would still sit. What about you? The line was originally a response to the officer who claimed Echo was dangerous. Now it had become a moral challenge for the entire society. If a creature with fangs, capable of violence, still chose to sit, why couldn't those with power do the same? A map circulated online showing places Echo had served: Fallujah, Mosul, Kandahar, with the caption, "No one shot him in combat. He died for being too well trained in a country that calls itself civilized." Veterans forums began unearthing records, confirming Rubin had once been the highest-ranking canine trainer at Fort Bragg. A 2008 video resurfaced, showing him standing in a training yard speaking to young handlers. A dog doesn't need to understand why a command is given. It just needs to trust the one who gives it. Now, viewers understood. Echo didn't react because he trusted Rubin to handle it, and Rubin did know. Gun drawn, no shouting, no added harm. He simply stood, his version of combat, without armor. People started printing those quotes as wall art for schools, police stations, and even city council rooms, not as protest banners, but as reminders. There is discipline that makes no sound, and it's worth more than orders with sirens. The movement spread so far that an international animal rights group submitted a petition to the United Nations, demanding that Special Operations Canine units be recognized as combat personnel entitled to protection. A senator spoke on live TV. "Maybe we should start with something simple, at least build a national cemetery for creatures that never betrayed anyone in their lives." Rubin remained silent. But an old comrade who had served with him in Iraq wrote, "He's not the kind of man who will say anything, but when he stood, the whole squad knew to go quiet." Now the entire country is learning how to do the same. The video lasted less than 3 minutes, the image slightly shaky from being filmed on a phone, light casting across the face of a middle-aged man. He wore a plain shirt, had short gray hair, and spoke slowly, evenly. "I used to be a patrol officer in North Carolina. In 2003, I pulled my gun because I thought the guy was reaching into his pocket for something. He was just pulling out his keys. I didn't fire, but my finger had already tightened halfway. Since that day, I've asked myself, if I had shot, then who would I be?" Then he paused, looking directly into the lens, not flinching. "What happened, Jermaine? I panicked once, but I never killed something that was sitting still. And if I had, I don't know if I could still call myself a cop." The clip spread with strange speed, not because it was an apology, but because it was an admission. The man in the video didn't excuse himself, didn't cite pressure or systemic flaws. He simply described one brief moment when instinct strayed from ethics, and how, had he fired in that moment, he might no longer be himself. In the comments, thousands began asking questions the legal system had long avoided. Why did they call him a vagrant when he'd lived there for 7 years? One person reposted satellite imagery of the house Rubin had rented, a modest one-story with a small porch where Echo used to sit in the afternoons. Why does a man walking near his home become a threat just because he's walking a dog and wearing a faded shirt? The questions didn't stop in the comments. A group of journalists began revisiting previous cases of mistaken identity in the area. There was an incident where an Asian man was detained for holding a takeout box. A brown-skinned teenager was questioned for carrying a large backpack, but none sparked the same fury as police assaulting a non-aggressive creature and labeling its owner suspicious, right in the neighborhood where he had lived. A satellite map pulled from residential data confirmed Rubin Shaw had a registered residence in the neighborhood since 2014. Military records matched that address with the official registration of a service dog. Echo, according to military data, had served as a K-9 unit member in Iraq and was adopted by Rubin after they were both discharged. A 2016 audio recording, once featured by military media, described Echo as an asset who not only completed missions but maintained emotional order for its commander. Yet in the initial police report, Rubin was listed as an unverified resident, non-compliant when asked for leash inspection. and Echo was described as a non-certified working dog, that note became a fresh spark of outrage, especially after a senior military official from the Pentagon confirmed Echo was a certified psychological operations unit, awarded canine duty status. Local police have no authority to revoke that status just because it sat still. An article in a sociology journal called it the denial mechanism of stillness, a structure that prioritizes reaction over recognition. When behavior that causes no disruption is still viewed as a threat, not because it's dangerous, but because the observer is unfamiliar with calmness in a skin tone they fear. Reuben didn't answer any questions, but someone said that when he saw the post online, he simply nodded once and said, "Silence doesn't mean I'm wrong. Silence means the truth doesn't need to scream to be real." And among the surging comments, one person wrote, "If that dog could sit and still be killed, who among us can stand and feel safe?" The satellite map spread overnight, not because of what it showed directly, but because of what lay beneath. The image of a small wooden house at the end of the street was marked with a faint red outline, the front porch shaded with the silhouette of a familiar animal curled under the awning. Accompanying data confirmed the coordinates and continuous residence from 2014 to the present. No signs of moving, no change of address forms, no gaps in pet registration records. Reuben Shaw lived there with Echo for 10 years. At the same time, an independent journalist dug through public military records and found Echo's name listed 3 times in reports from the Canine Special Operations Unit. One was during the Mosul operation, and another from a night mission at the Syrian border. No documents specified the breed, but descriptions matched the Malinois, a high-pressure breed chosen for special missions due to its controlled reflexes. One report read, "Echo unit responded precisely under fire, did not engage without command," and in a painful reversal, the final image was of Echo collapsing for not reacting while being attacked in a civilian alley during peacetime on the very soil it once served. The questions began, not from experts, but from the public. If they killed Echo for not barking, what will they do to people who just sit still? No one answered, but that's why the questions stayed, spread, and cut through every layer of language used by official agencies to defend themselves. It forced people to see that things trained not to trigger fear were still treated as threats because of how they looked, how they sat, their fur, their eyes. A group of human rights attorneys released a report titled Silent Targets, analyzing data from 52 shootings where the victims showed no resistance. Over 70% were people of color. Another report listed creatures neutralized due to abnormal behavior, dogs that didn't bark, children who didn't speak, adults who avoided conversation, people with speech impairments, misread as defiant. They called it the response to stillness. The more violent a society becomes, the more its people are trained to fear calm. Silence becomes suspicious, non-resistance becomes provocation, and, in Echo's case, stillness became the reason someone pulled the trigger. A sociologist stated on national television, Echo's silence wasn't a danger signal, it was the most correct response a combat unit could be trained for, and yet that's what got him killed. The question now isn't why police fired, but why a being was discarded for learning the best thing the system ever taught him. Drawings began appearing on city walls. A dog sitting, ears slightly raised, eyes straight ahead. Below it, a scribbled sentence, "I didn't bark, and you shot me." No signature, no group taking credit, no political branding, just words from someone who had seen themselves in that posture. In an internal meeting among law enforcement, a seasoned commander spoke up. "We can't keep training officers to react to everything that doesn't please them. Misunderstanding is not a threat, it's a reminder. We might not have learned enough to see the human in what isn't said aloud." And when Echo's image was posted on the bulletin board of an elementary school, one student stood up and said, "If that dog knew how to stay calm while people yelled, maybe the people should have known how to stay still when it just wanted to sit. The quote was written down, printed, and pinned to the board, not like an angry slogan on the streets, but like a new principle for teaching kids how to see the world, starting with silence, but as something waiting to be understood. The photo hung in the corner of the cafe, near the window, where early sunlight passed through the frosted glass and slanted onto the wooden floor. In the picture, Reuben sat on the porch steps, Echo lying close to his left leg, head resting on his thigh. Light fell gently across the dog's snout, casting a shadow on the shoulder of the retired soldier. No caption, no flashy backdrop, just a small line engraved into the thin wood beneath the frame. Unit K9, never left behind. Customers didn't ask. They drank coffee, scribbled in notebooks, typed on laptops, quiet as if the photo's presence was a necessary part of the space, like the old lamp, like the soft hum of the espresso machine each morning. A young reporter showed up near closing when the cafe had thinned out. He didn't glance at the photo first, but headed straight to where Reuben was sitting in the far corner. On the table was a black book with no title. A server had just set down a glass of water. The reporter pulled out a notebook and asked directly, "Do you plan to speak to the public?" No greeting, no preamble, as if the interview had begun the moment his internal recorder switched on. Reuben closed the book and set it aside. He didn't look at the man across from him, but stared through the window, where the trees outside shifted gently in the breeze. The pause was long. Then he spoke, voice low but firm. "I used to say a lot, but silence is the strongest language when the other side refuses to listen." The reporter hesitated, then chuckled softly, almost reflexively. "You mean the public isn't ready to hear the truth?" Reuben turned to him for the first time, eyes not angry, just deeply tired. "I'm not talking about the public. I'm talking about the system, a place that only hears what it thinks it can manage and ignores what it can't control." The reporter froze. He had prepared questions about politics, the military, about Echo's identity, even about the ethics of sharing images without consent. But in front of him was a man who wasn't defensive, wasn't evasive, and wasn't rushing to explain. And it was that calm directness that made all his questions feel suddenly off-key. Reuben pulled an old, slightly blurry photo from his pocket and slid it across the table. "This was the last time Echo was on duty. After that, he never left my side, not because I needed protection, but because he needed someone who didn't give orders." The reporter picked it up, looked closely, then asked, "Did you ever think if you'd shouted that day, things might have turned out differently?" Reuben shook his head slowly. "If I'd shouted, I'd be no different than them. If I'd reacted with rage, I would have lost what sets me apart from them." Echo didn't need vengeance. He needed to be recognized as part of the order he once upheld. Outside the window, a patrol car passed by. No sirens, no rush, just a routine drive. But the reporter followed it with his eyes, as if replaying the entire conversation, trying to grasp what makes someone choose silence when the world demands a voice. On his way out, he paused before the photo on the wall. He placed a hand on the carved words, an unconscious gesture. Another line appeared beneath, smaller, nearly fading into the grain of the wood. "They don't need the name if they understand the place." And perhaps in that moment he understood that not every presence needs a name to mean something. Some exist only to remind us that someone once sat there, held to what was right, not with words but with an unyielding presence. The night passed without sirens. No patrols more urgent than usual. But the next morning, in front of the police department's main entrance, a bright red phrase appeared like a blade stabbed into the cold concrete. "He didn't move, and you shot." Handwritten, the lines shaky but bold, as if the writer had tried to carve out exactly what the city was trying to forget. No camera caught the moment, though the area was under 24-hour surveillance. When the tech team reviewed the footage, there was a brief gap, signal interference, lasting just long enough for a sentence to become undeniable evidence. The news spread that morning. Just as staff arrived, coffee still warm, shirts not yet creased. Everyone stopped. Some took pictures. Others stared. No one spoke. A young officer sighed and walked inside, leaving behind a courtyard where everything appeared normal except for the wall that had been rewritten. The forensics team came to clean the paint, but the lead technician muttered, "Leave it, it's the truth after all." That afternoon, a group of journalism students arrived to film. They didn't conduct interviews, didn't bring microphones. They stood in a line before the wall, each holding a small sign quoting different lines from the incident. Some cited Reuben, some held photos of Echo. One girl raised a cardboard sign that read, "Stillness doesn't mean harmless, but harmless should never be killed." Reuben didn't go there. He sat in his old wooden house, window slightly open, sunlight falling on the table where Echo's collar still lay in place. He looked at it as one might look at a memory they never wanted to grow old. The phone on the table didn't ring. No texts came in, but his email inbox held hundreds of invitations, requests to speak, be interviewed, appear on panels. He pushed them aside, hand resting lightly on the collar, not to hold on, but as a final confirmation. His silence wasn't weakness. It was because some things, once spoken, lose the weight they carry in silence. That evening, an elderly couple from the neighborhood dropped by. They left a small bouquet at the gate with a handwritten card. "We used to see you and Echo every morning. He didn't bark, didn't jump, just waited as you picked up the paper. We want our grandchildren to live in a place where things like that are no longer seen as dangerous." A middle school teacher posted a short blog, saying the entire class had watched the video of Echo being shot. No fast-forwarding, no edits, just the full truth. After it ended, none of the students spoke, but in the next day's literature class, each submitted an essay under the open prompt, "What does it mean to stay silent at the right time?" Some wrote about their grandfather, others about a friend who didn't fight back when bullied. One student wrote about the dog in the video. It didn't understand why it was shot, but it didn't blame the one who fired. As the sun set, light slanted through the police station's glass, falling across the phrase that still hadn't been scrubbed. Some locals pulled over, got out, and took pictures. Among them was a woman with a boy about 7. The boy read the words aloud, then turned to his mother and asked, "Why did they shoot him if he didn't do anything wrong?" She didn't answer right away. She bent down, gently brushed his hair aside, and said, "We'll remember, so one day no child ever has to ask that question again." And in that moment, on the stained stone wall in a neighborhood too used to senseless things, something was made clear, that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the sound of a gunshot, but when people no longer have the courage to question the bullet. And maybe it's from a single sentence painted in the dark, with paint, with anger, with memory, that those questions begin to reclaim their place. A memo from the Pentagon arrived in the early morning, marked urgent, signed by a representative of Strategic Command. The document was brief, but the wording left no room for ambiguity. It requested all data on military K-9 units from the past 10 years. The attached list had one name highlighted in yellow, Echo, K9D, ID 47, ICI 2013, with the final note, retired, companion of MD Reuben Shaw. The local legal department received it in tense silence. The records officer spoke first. "I thought that was a civilian dog." Another replied slowly, "Thought that was enough reason to pull the trigger?" The meeting ended early. A special investigator was dispatched from Washington the same day. Without media fanfare or a support team, he entered the police office with one question: who fired the shot? The younger officer was summoned that afternoon. He wore no uniform. Hollow eyes, gaunt features from sleepless nights, hair disheveled and sweaty as if he'd just recovered from a fever. Upon entering, he bowed but kept his eyes on the floor. No one told him to sit. He stood for the entire session. The investigator opened the file, leafed through it without looking up, voice steady and cold. "I'm not here to process a civilian case. I'm tasked with protecting the honor of units that fought where no one else dared." Then he looked up directly. "Did you know the creature you shot held a rank higher than many officers?" The officer stammered. I didn't know. I thought it was stray." "Stray?" the investigator repeated, emphasizing the word as if carving it into the air. An animal sitting right next to a person in uniform, not charging, not growling, not moving. You thought it was stray. The silence that followed stretched on until the exchange felt like a formal interrogation. A military specialist brought in a copy of the K-9 unit file. Echo's photo appeared in the top left corner with a handwritten note. Survived 3 fire zones, never reacted without command. Under the photo, in the supporting achievements section, was Reuben Shaw's signature and a single sentence. This one never left his post. When the investigator placed the copy in front of the officer, he couldn't look up. He clenched his fists. Sweat trickled down his spine. The man across from him didn't shout or rage. He spoke in a voice that silenced the room. You didn't kill a dog. You erased the name of a warrior because you didn't know how to see honor in silence. The officer opened his mouth to reply, but the investigator raised a hand to stop him. He retrieved a recording tape from his briefcase, an interview with Reuben from many years ago. Reuben's voice played clearly and firmly. Echo didn't just know how to fight, it knew when to stop fighting when it wasn't necessary. That's something people often forget. Recognizing when to stop can be more important than knowing when to go forward. Stillness held the room. Finally, the investigator stood and delivered the closing statement. This case won't be closed with an apology letter. It will be recorded as a sentence, not for one person, but for how we teach each other to react to what we don't understand. The officer bowed his head, pressing it against the table. No one comforted him. No one patted his shoulder, because, at that moment, nothing could soothe it except the admission he failed to distinguish between a threat and a demonstration of discipline. The next day, Echo's name was officially reinstated in the K-9 Veteran Registry, with an added note, "Deceased in duty," with silence. From then on, anyone who accessed that file wouldn't just see a name. They'd face the question, why is the quietest being met with the harshest reaction? The hearing took place in a small room inside the local courthouse, where fluorescent lights shone down on a long wooden table and 2 chairs facing each other. No press, no cameras, only the investigator, the summoned officer, and a representative from military command. A copy of Echo's service record lay in the middle of the table, its edges slightly wrinkled. A red pen had marked key dates: enlisted in 2013, trained at Fort Bragg, deployed in Mosul and Syria, and retired in September 2019. At the bottom, the final note read, "Retired with honors, reassigned as permanent companion." The investigator didn't begin with a formal statement. He simply read each line slowly, then looked up. "Did you know the animal you shot was military?" The young officer clenched his hands, a twitch in his cheek. "I didn't know the dog was military." "You didn't know? Or you never thought a dog could be military?" The question didn't wait for an answer. The air in the room thickened. The investigator leaned forward. So if that day, instead of a brown dog sitting still, it had been a white child, sitting still, resisting, would you have pulled the trigger? The question struck like a cold blow. All sound dropped. The young officer bowed his head. No one spoke again. No excuses, no apology, and no answer. The military representative stood, walked a slow circle around the table. He didn't look directly at the officer, but at the open file, where Echo's photo sat along the page margin. Military rank doesn't come from weapons or medals, it comes from knowing the position you hold. Echo understood that. That statement wasn't recorded in the official transcript, but it echoed clearly enough for everyone to understand this was no longer about an animal. This was a confrontation between 2 value systems, one that believes power comes from reaction, and another that believes strength lies in the ability not to react immediately. When the session ended, the young officer left in silence. His steps were heavy and slow, as if every stride dragged a consequence behind it. The investigator didn't walk him out, only noted one line in the file's margin. "Did not answer child question." There was no press coverage, but the leaked information spread fast. Forums began debating not the legality of the shooting, but the morality of reflex. A short editorial in the local paper asked directly, "Does skin color decide innocence, even when the behavior is the same?" name. A simple question, but one that echoed like an unhealed wound. A retired criminal law professor shared publicly, "When a question about a white child goes unanswered, that is the answer. Because if you can't say no, I wouldn't have fired, then you're admitting that you might." Conversations are no longer centered on echo as a single symbol. It became the starting point for redefining power, fear, and the line between reflex and prejudice. A high school held an open discussion titled, "Whom do we teach as threats and why?" In class, a 12th grader said, "If a person can't tell the difference between a threat and a being that's just sitting, they shouldn't hold a gun, cop, or civilian." None of those students had met Echo, but the image of a creature sitting silently and being shot for its stillness left a mark deeper than any campaign, because in the end, its death didn't make people question the dog. It made them ask themselves, what would if the one sitting in front of me didn't look like me? There was no media presence, no reporters invited to the hearing, but when Reuben entered the room, all 3 rows of seats were already filled. Senior officers, defense law advisors, human rights representatives, members from the Department of the Interior, and the last 3 seats reserved for the veterans' community delegates. He offered no greeting. He didn't walk quickly or slowly. His pace was measured, just enough that every eye followed each step. He reached the table, carrying no documents, reading no notes. From inside his coat, he took out a dog collar, neatly coiled, placed at the center of the table, the inside facing up. A strip of sun-worn leather, still clearly engraved, Echo, Unit K9, stand down only when safe. No one spoke. An old general leaned forward, eyes fixed on the leather strap. The hearing chair didn't interrupt. The silence didn't linger for drama. It simply existed as the only thing that could fill the space a loyal being once held. Reuben placed his hand on the table, eyes not aimed at anyone in particular. He began with a sentence that needed no introduction. "We taught them loyalty, taught them to wait for orders, taught them not to react when provoked, and when they were killed for that obedience, we turned away." A council member began to object, but the chair lifted a hand gently, signaling to continue. Reuben looked straight toward the center row. Echo once crossed a minefield because he misread a signal. He survived, but he learned that the mistake belonged to the one who gave the order, and after that, he never reacted to shouting again. He paused, letting his gaze sweep the room. "You ask why I didn't intervene. I ask in return, how does a soldier stop a bullet that the system had already chambered years ago?" His hand rested on the collar, fingers running along the edge like soothing a scar. His voice wasn't loud, didn't tremble, but was clear to the last syllable. "They fired out of fear for what they didn't understand, and this society taught them that what cannot be understood can be eliminated." A young attorney scribbled notes without looking up. Reuben continued, waiting for no cue. "I'm not asking for their apology. I want them to understand. Understand that a being who knows how to sit still in chaos isn't a threat. It's the only thing holding order back from the hands of instinct." The chair leaned back, hands interlocked, adding no comment. Reuben lowered his voice, as if speaking to himself. "I once told Echo, during a night waiting for reinforcements in Fallujah, you don't have to be a beast. You just have to stand there, so others know there's a line." And he did. That, until someone crossed that line with a whistle and a gun off safety. There was no applause, no coughs. Everyone in the room stayed still, as if any movement might cause those final words to dissolve. Reuben unwrapped the collar, folded it back into his coat pocket. When he stood, he added only one more sentence. "I didn't come to recount a death. I came to remind you that silence has structure, and when you shoot at it, you don't just kill a creature. You fire into the best thing this system ever made." Then he left the room. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for anyone to speak. And behind him, the room remained in silence, as if, for the first time, they began to understand that some presences don't need a voice to define loss. Inside the hearing room, white light beamed straight down from the ceiling, casting no shadow. Those seated behind Reuben stayed silent, not because of their titles or legal roles, but because there were no arguments valid enough to interrupt a string of words that had said just enough. He didn't stand while speaking, didn't change expression or tone, but each sentence struck like a needle piercing the console of a machine long out of calibration. Echo once crossed a minefield because he misread a signal. Reuben said it like reading from an old report, not tinged with pain, not exposing emotion. He simply affirmed it, as if documenting an act already verified. He survived. And after that incident, he learned something many people never do, that not every sound is a command. The hearing chair frowned slightly, not in disagreement but forced to confront a flaw never previously named in the reflex training model of authority. Others in the room kept their heads down to take notes, but their hands stalled the moment the next sentence echoed, as clearly as a cold verdict. But he never reacted to shouting. Each word peeled back another layer of a system reliant on shouting to establish order, while a four-legged creature, deemed lower, weaker, had learned to distinguish between noise and instruction. The contrast weighed down the room, as if a hairline crack had split the inner walls of everyone present. Reuben paused, looking toward the left side, where one council member served as senior advisor on ethical conduct in law enforcement. No name was mentioned, no direct address, yet he continued, "And you respond to everything you don't understand by eliminating it." No one replied, because no one wanted to respond. To react would be to admit belonging to the group he referenced, and in that prolonged silence, it was the absence of a reply that became the proof. An old soldier, a former combat medic, nodded slightly. He had once seen Echo along the northern border, had seen how the dog lay still under gunfire, never leaving his post even when troops had to retreat. That animal understood what it meant to wait for orders better than people do, he murmured, seemingly to himself, but loud enough for the row to hear. Reuben didn't need to add anything. What he had delivered closed like a battlefield report. No emotion, no commentary, only facts. But it was that lack of emotional framing that forced everyone to enter the silent space of reason, where no one could hide behind semantics or excuses. A young lawyer seated in the far back wrote on his blog after the hearing, "I used to think people shoot out of fear. Now I understand, sometimes, people kill because they can't bear the silence within themselves when facing what they can't control." Echo's silence, in the moment the trigger was pulled, wasn't just a trained reflex. It was the final reminder of discipline, of intelligent obedience. And when someone pulls the trigger against that silence, the act is no longer self-defense. It's a symptom of breakdown. While public attention remained focused on the image of Echo and Reuben's words, an old file was reopened from the police department's internal complaint system. It was a report from over 8 years ago about a mid-ranking officer accused of assaulting a young black man during a random stop. In the incident report, the victim's statement read clearly, "He didn't ask, didn't explain, just walked up and punched me in the face before I could even open my wallet." But that file, according to the records officer, had been classified as insufficient evidence because the area's camera system was non-functional at the time. The name on the file was not unfamiliar. It belonged to the older officer present with his partner on the day Echo was shot, the same one who had laughed, saying, "These dogs are trained with violence," and who had previously been temporarily removed from the field during the investigation, only to return to duty a few months later. At the time, there was no press coverage. The community never knew, and the department opted for silence to avoid escalation. But now, the matter could no longer be buried. A team of independent lawyers, including former prosecutors and human rights advocates, filed an emergency motion with the federal court, urging a full investigation into the officer's entire conduct history. Their focus extended beyond the dog shooting. They posed a broader question. Was there a pattern of implicit bias sustained quietly within the police force, tolerated by systemic inertia, and shielded by the silence of those with the power to speak? This time, the file wasn't sealed. The federal court accepted the petition and announced an initial hearing. The summons was made public. Individuals involved in past incidents began to come forward. Some sent handwritten letters. Others emailed with a simple subject line, "I was beaten, I'm still alive, and I want to speak." The press didn't need to dig. They only had to open their inboxes to receive truths that had been suppressed for years. On digital platforms, public comments began to shift. What began as outrage over Echo turned into deeper questions about how an officer with multiple complaints was still allowed to carry a weapon, make life and death decisions, and act without consequence. One independent news article wrote, "The problem isn't just that you shot a dog, it's that you were trained to believe violence is a way to make others shut up, and the system kept agreeing by staying silent." In an internal meeting between police leadership and legal advisors, one statement was documented. "We were wrong to think silence protects the institution. In fact, that silence is what's pushing us into a corner we can't escape." Rubin didn't attend any meetings, but one of the attorneys representing the veterans community quoted him in a formal request to subpoena witnesses. "If a voiceless creature can still be defined as a threat, then any explanation offered after its death comes too late." That sentence was printed on the cover page of the official file submitted to the court. Within the police department grounds, a wooden plaque was quietly erected by the back fence. No name, no image, just one line engraved. "Justice doesn't begin with a verdict. It begins when we dare to reopen what was once closed." This time, it wasn't removed like the painted messages before. Unlike paint, wood can't be wiped clean. It can only be replaced or kept as a reminder that something once demanded to be faced from within. The sky had yet to fully brighten, but the courthouse entrance was already crowded. No shouting, no loudspeakers, just people holding up signs with handwritten, uneven words that looked as raw as the emotions behind them. No one should have to die to prove they lived right. At their feet lay white daisies, evenly spread like an unofficial ritual. No one organized the gathering, yet it unfolded as if it had long been scheduled. A veteran stood in the center with an old dog, his faded jacket reading clearly, "Canine Unit, still serving." He said nothing. His presence was a testimony on its own. Inside the hearing room, pale yellow light reflected off the long table where federal representatives were already seated. Rubin was not present, not because he refused, but because he had left a simple note. "I've said what needed to be said. What remains is the system's responsibility." The presiding officer tapped the gavel and opened the hearing. The first question was posed, not directed at anyone specific, but landing squarely in a room full of attorneys, officials, and citizens. "When does a dog deserve to be called a teammate?" There was no immediate reply because it wasn't a question seeking a definition or a truth that needed confronting. A military advisor laid a file on the table, opened to a 2014 entry, and pointed to a note. "Assigned to guard the main cable line at Mosul Outpost, held position for 17 hours without leaving." He spoke calmly, evenly. "If a creature can hold a post for 17 hours in combat, I don't know what more we require to call it a team." A human rights attorney followed, placing before the room satellite images of Echo's patrol paths and a photo of Echo sitting beside Rubin, both in civilian clothes. She didn't address policy, but principle. "We gave it a title when it obeyed. We called it a symbol when it crossed a minefield. But when it sat quietly on a city street without a badge, we failed to recognize it." So, is a teammate only someone who looks familiar? The silence that followed was its own response, revealing that the answer lived in the gray space between law and instinct. A policy analyst tapped a pen on the table's edge, asking pointedly, "If Echo had worn a canine badge that day, would anyone have pulled the trigger?" Another voice cut in, "And if not, does that mean life is protected by symbols, not by behavior?" The conversation shifted. Federal statutes were re-examined, compared against existing protocols for handling animals in public areas. People began to realize there were unaddressed gaps because no one had dared to clearly define where the line was between a loyal animal and a perceived threat. A council member referenced lessons from rescue units. "We train dogs to find victims by the scent of blood, but we've never taught humans that safety doesn't lie in silence, but in the ability to not react under threat." The hearing didn't end with applause or uproar. It ended with the full case file being transferred to a newly formed special commission, established within 24 hours, not to defend Echo, but to review every incident involving the use of force against animals by law enforcement over the past decade. Outside, in the courthouse hallway, a boy wearing a school backpack stood beside his mother, peering in. He asked, "Mom, if I sit still like that dog, who will protect me?" The mother didn't answer right away. She bent down to retie his shoelace, then said quietly, "I won't let you ever have to ask that again." And in that promise, the hearing had fulfilled its first task, to compel those who had never considered their responsibility to finally begin answering. In the courtroom, the air felt heavy not because of the people, but because of everything left unsaid. Most faces present that day weren't the central figures, but representatives of a system. Lawyers, the judge, military justice officials, and those serving as witnesses. One seat remained empty in the front row. It was Reuben's. He did not appear. He sent a written statement instead, exactly 1 page long, signed in blue ink at the bottom. "I'm not here to hear others speak of fear. I've lived through it, and I walked a creature across that line only to see it killed for being silent." The young officer entered in a rumpled gray suit, as if he himself wasn't sure whether he was a defendant, a witness, or an afterthought in a larger investigation. When he took the stand, he bowed his head for a long time, fists clenched, then opened them. Each time the judge reminded him of his right to remain silent, he nodded, but chose not to use it. "I thought it was going to leap at me." The words didn't land like testimony, but like a fracture. No one in the room responded right away. The court stenographer tapped lightly, paused, then resumed. One of the lawyers clicked their tongue softly. Then a voice cut through, from the woman of color seated on the right, representing the civil rights legal team. Because it was a black dog, the room's sound seemed to vanish. The officer didn't respond. He looked up briefly toward the attorney, then back down. No denial, no refusal, no confirmation. But this silence, this time, wasn't taken as innocence. It was taken as admission, or at least as something that couldn't be defended. Another lawyer stood, not to question, but to read aloud from the file. The animal was documented as unresponsive to loud noises, trained by special forces, with no history of aggression and sitting still at the time of the incident. Yet the subject interpreted that as a sign of attack. So why is sitting still interpreted as a threat? No one could answer that, because the answer wasn't in the law. It lived in the lens people carried every day when walking the street, wearing a uniform, looking at a person or a dog, and making a split-second choice, friend or threat. The judge intervened, her voice low and deliberate. "We are judging a police officer, but also judging a collective reflex, where anything that doesn't fit the pattern gets discarded." Then she turned to the defendant, not with a tone of punishment, but like someone searching for an explanation. "Were you ever trained to recognize what is not a threat?" The officer stayed quiet. After a pause, he spoke softly. "We were trained to spot danger, but almost no one taught us how to see peace." The judge placed her hand on the desk. Under the soft light from the ceiling window, her face seemed to age by a few years. She didn't deliver a prison sentence, but she issued another kind of penalty. No jail time, but there will be consequences. Your right to carry a weapon is permanently revoked. You may not serve in any enforcement agency within this state again. Then she continued, as if placing something in the record that needed no defense. No one should be allowed to carry a gun if they lack the reason to see the difference between silence and a cry for help made in silence. No applause followed, but everyone in the room understood. This was a trial held among the living, to pass judgment on what was no longer present. Echo was not there. Reuben wasn't either. But the essence of the trial was aimed squarely at the system itself, to answer the question, do we deserve to retain the right to judge if we can't hear what has yet to be said? The young officer stood at the witness stand, eyes lowered, voice nearly swallowed by the dense air in the courtroom. "Because I was taught that anything silent but muscular is dangerous." The statement wasn't loud, wasn't defiant, but each word landed like spreading ink, exposing the core of a training training model built on fear rather than understanding. In the public gallery, silence held firm. Some closed their eyes. Some looked away, avoiding contact with a truth long assumed but never spoken aloud. In a society where speech is seen as power, the silence of a creature, whether human or not, is easily mistaken for a threat, especially if that creature is muscular, especially if it's not white. The judge placed both hands on the bench, pausing a moment before speaking. She looked directly at the defendant, not harshly, not loudly, but with eyes that made any prepared defense evaporate before it could be said. You say you were taught that, but did you ever ask yourself who taught you that, and who they taught you to protect? The defendant did not answer. The question no longer belonged to legal procedure, it was a moral question, forcing the listener to revisit their training memories, their evaluative frameworks, their internal map of recognition, where skin color, barking, muscle, and silence had all been grouped into one category: potential threat. The judge lifted her gavel, then set it down gently instead of striking. She didn't need sound to deliver a verdict. The courtroom's silence had already set the weight behind every word she was about to speak. No prison sentence, she declared, voice steady and clear, but there will be consequences. You are permanently barred from carrying a firearm in any state. That right is not for those who treat everything they don't understand as a threat. A keyboard click echoed. Court, stenographer locking in every word like the final nails in a faulty machine's control panel. The judge went on, more slowly this time, as if wanting everyone in the room, not just the defendant, to absorb every syllable. No one should carry a gun if they don't also carry reason. The sentence rang out like a maxim etched into the stone outside the courthouse. It wasn't just for that day, but for every day after, for every officer still in the field, every training manual being written, every child who would one day be taught about power and restraint. The young officer left the courtroom unshackled, unescorted, but on his shoulders rested a different weight, unseen, unrecorded, but unmistakably present, the weight of a reflex that had killed what should have been preserved. On the courthouse steps he paused, looked out over the crowd, and saw a child walking a puppy. The child glanced back at him, not afraid, not curious, just a direct gaze. He nodded slightly, then stepped down. For the first time, unarmed, without a badge, he walked into a society where actions could no longer be explained with the phrase, "I was trained." And in that rawness, for the first time, he understood. Silence is not always a sign of weakness. Sometimes it is where everything we lack the courage to name begins. Echo had sat still, and he had failed to see it. After the trial, the verdict didn't end with the individual. It spread to institutions, forcing each department to re-examine itself. The young officer, though not sentenced to prison, was permanently stripped of his right to carry a firearm nationwide. No agency, from private security to special forces, was permitted to rehire someone who had fired at a creature sitting still. The system didn't call it punishment, but a protective measure not just for the community, but for the very definition of reflex and professional ethics. Yet public attention didn't stop there. On the table of the Committee on National Defense and Civil Safety, a new bill was introduced under a short title, the ECHO Act. Its main provision: all animals that served in the military, working dogs, logistical horses, even specialized training units, must be formally identified when returning to civilian life. Not by tags, not by vaccination records, but by an ID code with an official service record, so that even without a uniform, their existence would not be mistaken for being ownerless. A member of Congress spoke in a closed session. If a creature has crossed war zones, stood beside humans in combat, and is then killed on the street for sitting still, our identification system is the problem, not the creature. The view quickly gained support from the Pentagon. In a rare statement, a senior military official wrote, "Echo wasn't killed for being a dog. Echo was killed for being a symbol that people didn't know how to confront." That statement was quoted across major publications, accompanied by an image of Echo's old collar, worn, broken in one spot, missing its clasp. The photo appeared in a special weekly edition. Beneath the caption, "The verdict wasn't the judge's ruling, it was the scar left on what once held life." At the tomb of the unknown soldier, where battlefield artifacts are preserved in glass, Echo's collar was placed on display. No medals, no lengthy placard, just a polished black stone engraved with "Trained not to react" and "Killed for doing it right." Visitors stood before the stone, looking at the collar resting on dark velvet. Some took photos, others quietly jotted notes. A child asked, "Why didn't it bite back?" His mother answered, "Because it was taught that holding its position mattered more than instinct." The answer, seemingly too lofty for a child, was enough to keep him quiet for a long while. At police training academies, a new module was added to the curriculum: reflex and restraint, recognizing non-threats. The content didn't teach how to shoot, but how to recognize stillness. One training officer read aloud to the class, "If a creature that crossed a war zone can wait for a command, then you have no excuse to act like you're the only one under threat." Reuben made no public comment about the new law, but someone recounted seeing him visit the memorial, standing before Echo's collar and placing a small folded note. When staff opened it, inside was a single pencil-written line: "If honor doesn't come from a badge, then justice doesn't need handcuffs." The story of Echo didn't end in a courtroom hallway, nor did it stop in the display case. It quietly continued, changing unnoticed details: the way a soldier knocks on a civilian's door, the way an officer steps out of a patrol car, the way people see silence no longer as a default threat. From a single gunshot, a collar became a map leading back to something thought lost: the ability to distinguish behavior from bias, reflex from choice, and survival from living with dignity. Echo's collar sat behind thick glass, not polished, not framed in gold, just placed on dark velvet. No accompanying image, no long description like other military artifacts. Just a small inscription beneath: K9 unit, no retreat, not left behind. The exhibit stood in the left-hand corner of the entry hall. Not center stage, but positioned so every passing glance would stop there. An old soldier in a faded uniform stood before the glass for a long time. In his hand was his cap, his eyes fixed on the worn part of the collar, where a metal clasp once broke during an evacuation. He had served as a logistics officer in Reuben's unit and witnessed Echo's first deployment. That creature knew when to move, when to stay, and it never stepped out of position under threat. It followed trust, not commands shouted. He sent that statement to the memorial's administrators, not for display, but to be added to the archives. A Pentagon statement, released after the exhibit opened, contained a line that sparked wide debate. Echo wasn't killed for being a dog, but for being a symbol people refused to face. The line prompted questions. If a symbol can be shot, what exactly is our system training? Obedience or endurance? But within the backlash, something also became clear. Echo had become part of a military history never taught in textbooks. A symbol that didn't speak, didn't march, didn't step onto a podium, but still made hundreds of thousands pause to ask themselves whether they could tell the difference between action and appearance. Outside the memorial, a new stone wall was erected. On its face were dozens of small metal tags, old dog tags sent in from across the country. Some rusted, some were worn and unreadable, but all were arranged in a broken circle. In the center, an empty space, not left blank but left open to remind visitors. Some acts of service go unrecorded, and there may be more Echoes without armor, unnamed in formal records, who once held a position that could not be maintained by command alone. A group of students stood silently before the exhibit. Their teacher didn't explain. She asked one question: "If it had barked, do you think it would have lived?" The group stayed quiet. One girl raised her hand and answered softly, "Maybe," but it chose to sit still. The reply wasn't perfect, but enough to start the lesson with silence. At a brief press conference, a Defense Department spokesperson confirmed that Echo's collar wasn't displayed just as a symbol. It marked the beginning of a new identification initiative for animals that served in the military. Each K9 unit would be issued a unique ID tied to their training and service record. It wouldn't grant legal status, but it would shift how they were seen, not as support objects, but as a different form of team. Reuben made no statement after the exhibit. He left only a folded, handwritten note, slipped into the memorial's suggestion box. Echo was never a dog I trained. It was proof of something I was once taught, that a true soldier doesn't need to fight with noise, only hold their ground to the last moment. Beneath that note, someone added one more line. We understand now, and for the first time, the memorial accepted an artifact without a badge, without a certificate, unconnected to any official campaign, present only as a question about the value of silence. A silence was killed in broad daylight, and then returned through a collar with a broken clasp. At the Memorial Park on the city's south side, among rows of stone benches and trees planted by years of service, a new wooden table appeared beside the central fountain. No ribbon was cut, no speech delivered, and no organization claimed credit, but the table remained empty, except for a dog collar placed neatly in the center, its clasp rusted slightly from weather. Beneath the edge of the table, a faint steel plate bore the inscription, "For the silent ones who stood down." No exclamation mark, no emotion, just a flat, even line, like a soldier turning back from the final post, when no further orders would come. The line offered no further explanation, but those who had worn a uniform, who had survived zones where hand signals and eye contact replaced language, understood. This table wasn't for meals or gathering, but a reminder of the silences that held a line firm. The first person to sit beside it was a veteran whom no one recognized. Gray coat, folded collar, unpolished shoes, hair cut short but silvered at the temples. He brought no dog, no flag. Only a small tin box was placed beside the table leg. He opened it, took out a slightly bent metal tag. Most of the unit markings had faded, except for one word still clear: Echo. No one came to ask questions. No interviews followed. People passed by, looked over, and slowed their steps. Some took pictures with their phones, but no one spoke. The table, unnamed, didn't need a name. Its emptiness, its refusal to display a flag, spoke louder than any colors ever flown. The next day, a group of high school students came for a scheduled tour of the memorial. As they neared the table, they paused. No one told them to, but they instinctively slowed and stood in line. One girl pulled a notebook from her backpack, wrote something down, then passed it to the next. Each student silently took a turn writing, then placed the notebook at the edge of the table beside the chair before quietly walking away. A park employee found the notebook, flipped it open. On the first page was a line: "If sitting still is an act, we hope to have the courage to choose silence at the right time." No one knew who the students were, but the page was laminated and kept at the table next to the collar tag as an extension of the original message. 3 days later, a group of quiet visitors arrived. They carried old dog collars, worn, torn, missing tags. No one directed them, but one by one, they placed their collars on the tabletop, lying side by side, not stacked. When the table filled, they placed the rest at its base, then stood in silence, each touching a hand to the left side of their chest before turning and walking away. No applause followed, just nods from bystanders, as if something long unspoken was continuing without needing to be explained. A few days later, the city mayor issued a public statement. The table would remain untouched, not altered, not expanded, and not used as a political symbol. We didn't install that table, but when a table is placed by collective action, the system's job isn't to control it, but to leave it be. And so it stayed, through mornings filled with birdsong, noons with the sound of children running, and afternoons when those who had walked through war zones sat for a few minutes before moving on. The table had no flag, but every collar laid down became a kind of vow. No one else should be killed for staying still. And if that held true, the table never needed to grow larger, only to remain. The man sitting beside the table stayed in the same posture for hours, back straight, hands on knees, eyes fixed toward the memorial as if he didn't need to blink. No expression marked his face, no gestures wasted, just a stillness that made passers-by slow their steps. No one asked his name, no one needed to. His presence didn't evoke curiosity but respect, as if he weren't there for a friend, but for a principle that had been forgotten. As the day faded, a few people with dogs stopped near the table. Nothing was organized, but there was a quiet understanding in their eyes. One person removed a collar, kissed it, and laid it at the edge of the table. Another pulled from their pocket a metal tag. The inscription faded with time, and gently clipped it beside a collar already placed. No words were spoken, only action. This accumulation, built from small things, from daily habits, became an unnamed ritual. People left tags, collars, even handprints from their service days, with a reverence that needed no explaining. An elderly woman knelt, held a collar on the table, pressed her forehead to it, then stood and walked away. Her grandchild whispered, "Did you know Echo?" She didn't answer, but her grip on the leash grew firmer. The people came not in crowds or bursts, but in waves, like water against stone. Some just watched. Some placed collars and then left without waiting for acknowledgement. Others left small notes, written in slanted handwriting. "I didn't train my dog to fight. I taught it to hold a position, and now I have to teach my child to stay away from the police." A few days later, park workers quietly installed a sealed plexiglass box beneath the table to preserve the items left behind. There was no sign posted, just a compartment to protect the fragments the community had offered. No one sorted them. No one assessed their worth, whether a faded collar, a torn tag, or a sentence scrawled in pencil. Each piece was kept exactly as it came, part of an ongoing, silent conversation. A boy, around 12, led a small dog to the table with nothing in his hand. He crouched and whispered something into the dog's ear, then set it beside Echo's collar. The dog stayed still, no bark, no movement. As he rose, the boy said to his mother, "I don't know how to write, but I think I understand." She nodded and said nothing more. The event had no name, yet it spread, not through formal media, but through social networks. Stories told, blurry phone photos. The hashtag Stand Beside Echo became a new symbol, not of defiance against violence, but of loyalty betrayed by those sworn to protect it. In the soft light of an early morning, someone came to wipe the table. Not because of dust, but so the act itself could continue. They wiped slowly, each edge unrushed, as if cleansing collective memory. Then they walked away, leaving the table to stand. No flag planted, no leader named, but everyone who came understood. This was where to lay down what had once been priceless, yet was killed simply for being silent at the right time. And for that, the table needed no speech. Nor did the one sitting beside it need to speak. The silence, echoed by the collar, the gaze, each passing step, was already a conversation long enough for an entire society to pause and listen to what had never been said. Inside an elementary classroom on the city's outskirts, light filters through a narrow window, falling quietly across the blackboard where the teacher writes a big question. What makes a dog that doesn't bark still worthy of life? The children fall silent for a moment. A few frown, others peer at each other. Then almost at once tiny hands shoot up. The teacher nods to call on them, and the whole class replies in unison, "Because it knows how to stay still." That answer makes the adults present pause too. Not because it is beyond their age, but because it is so pure. Without any calculation, without defiance or agreement, it is simply the truth that children see when their view isn't clouded by bias. Staying still, a deliberate action. Not giving up, a dog choosing not to bark, not to lunge, not to react, and therefore it is deserving of life. The teacher continues the lesson by showing a black and white photo of Echo, printed from an online news source. In the image, the dog lies still, eyes closed, its old collar still around its neck, not removed. The teacher softly says, "This is a warrior. It received no medals, but it remained silent through every blast." The students bow their heads, some placing a hand gently on the photo as if to confirm that what they see is real. After class, the children are given a writing assignment. If you could talk to Echo, what would you say? One boy writes, "I would not lead him down that street. I would choose another way." A girl writes, "I would hug him before the police arrived." Another simply draws a dog seated beside a white flag. No words, no caption. The teacher understands and pins the drawing beside her desk as part of an ongoing lesson. The next day, the principal sends an internal email to all teachers. "I propose a week-long module on active silence." The phrase sounds unusual, but is quickly embraced. Classrooms do more than discuss power and resistance. They now explore restraint, the choices made without noise, the ways actions can be misread simply because they make no obvious signal. At the end of week parent meeting, a father stands to speak. "My child came home and said, 'Dad, don't shout when it's not needed.' Echo didn't shout and still kept his unit safe. I honestly didn't know how to respond." The room laughs softly, not because it's funny, but because everyone hears a truth the child just reminded them of. Silence is not retreat. It can be a way to preserve oneself and others whole. A fifth-grade teacher writes a handwritten letter to Ruben. In it, she explains how the class has shifted its view of reaction. Before, we taught kids to speak up, to react, to be strong. Now we add something else. Strength is sometimes knowing when to remain still. The letter comes with no gift, no urgency. It is simply shared, like Echo is being taught again through children who never met him. Ruben didn't reply to the letter, but a week later the school received a small package wrapped in aged brown paper, simply labeled "Donation to the Library." Inside was a slim book titled "Echo, Guardian in the Fire." No photo on the cover, only a subtly embossed image of Echo's collar. On the first page was a short dedication for those who never heard a bark but still understood the call to remain still. From that moment, Echo entered the library as a silent teacher, not speaking, not lecturing, not assigning, but reminding raised hands that not every right needs to be shouted. Some truths simply need to be upheld. The book was bound in dark brown wrapping, tied with a narrow cloth ribbon, "Sender Anonymous." When it reached the principal, the postmark was faint from rain, but traceable to Ruben's suburban district. No message besides the library label. Gift, place in quiet reading. She opened it with the care of handling evidence. The pages were sandy cream, the spine hand-bound, typeface uncommon, likely printed by a small press or transcribed from a long-ignored manuscript. On the first page was an italic quote, "Amidst gunfire, sometimes what saves a life never makes a sound." No author, no Ruben signature, no promotion. Yet, the dedication, for those teaching children stillness without bowing, made clear who had sent it and why. Tuesday morning, the fifth-grade teacher placed the book on her desk, but did not open it immediately. During the morning meeting, she read a brief excerpt from Chapter 3. Echo waited 5 minutes in a sand trench between explosions because it had received no clear signal. It waited while the entire unit pulled back. It did not bark, did not charge, did not react, and so it lived and kept its handler alive. The children fell silent. No whispers, no raised hands. They just looked at each other and then at her, waiting for another question. None came. She simply placed the book down and wrote one word on the board: "Stand." Since then, each week the class holds a silent reading session. Every student brings a book without illustrations, without a loud narrator, without dramatic climaxes. Stories told through small details, through stillness. One is about an old soldier tending a garden, another about a doctor treating deaf patients with sign language, and centrally, Echo Guardian in the Fire remains on display, never taken home or copied, but always available in the quiet reading corner for any child to open and discover their own lesson in silence. Echo's story has woven into other lessons. In moral education, students were asked, "When is silence resistance?" One replied, "When it's not avoidance, but standing in the place you must." In language arts, they rewrote an event from another's perspective. Some chose Echo's collar. "I am the link to loyalty," dragged through combat, then cut loose on a silent street. That essay was printed and shared with other classes. The book sparked no movement. It never appeared on TV or bestseller lists, yet its presence endured in the deepest sense. It became the symbol of a moment when adults didn't know what to say and children found the right language. Stand still, don't bow, don't react mindlessly, its silence showing its truth. At semester's end, the school held a small exhibition titled No Echo, Just Presence. Each student chose a corner to stand in silence, expressionless. After a minute, they moved to another spot. In the center stood a small wooden chair bearing a paper collar etched with Echo. No explanation was offered, yet the exhibition became the most memorable lesson of the year, because there, every answer was preserved in silence. A week after the final hearing, 3 states, Oregon, Illinois, and Virginia, simultaneously passed a new law named simply but clearly the Silent Comrade Recognition Act. Under it, any animal that has served in the U.S. military, living or retired, must be legally recognized as a distinct entity no longer classified as personal property or pet. This doesn't grant citizenship to animals but establishes a new boundary in how the system defines and treats them, bringing them to the table in order and operation, systematically, utilization, and margin. Under law, as established a full division and grant citizenship, the new boundary in how the system defines and treats them. The opening quote from the law went viral on social media. Silence is the language of loyalty. Treat it as a voice. No hashtags, no music, no filters, just white text on a black background, yet enough to make thousands pause while scrolling. Responses were brief, nods of agreement, or a small caller emoji, like signing a statement without declaring allegiance. At the Oregon State Capitol, the bill was signed in a low-key ceremony without press. The primary sponsor, a former military attorney, addressed the approving council. "We don't need to call them quad-legged veterans. We just need the system to stop ignoring when a comrade is killed without a record." No applause followed, but everyone rose, not out of protocol, but because a line had quietly shifted toward fairness. Across military academies and security training institutes, curricula were revised. At a federal canine training center, the first page of the handbook now includes, "Silent behavior may not signal intent, but it must not be assumed to pose a threat." You could see young trainees pause before turning the page, not because it was complex, but because it represented the system's first acknowledgement that silence isn't useless and stillness isn't surrender. Meanwhile, among veteran communities, the hashtag "Silence is a voice" spread as a symbol of recognition. While not everyone served with a canine unit, they knew they'd relied on silent signals, a nod, a glance, a shoulder shift at the right moment. Those untold stories of animals that didn't bark but saved lives by holding position were finally moving from the back office of memory into collective remembrance. In Washington, D.C., a senior senator spoke during a hearing on nationalizing the law. "We're not glorifying animals. We're restoring what we once dismissed as insignificant." Echo showed us how much dignity can be erased by a single bullet. In a coffee shop near Capitol Hill, a group of law students printed a large poster and stuck it to the window. "Some cases have no defendants, only silent witnesses left behind." The message didn't point to a specific incident, but anyone passing understood it echoed what had happened. They didn't need to know who Echo was, didn't need to see the collar or the owner. They just needed to read it and pause. The new law didn't erect temples or statues, but it did one thing clearly. If service once took place in silence, protection must also exist in that soundless zone. Echo was no longer just a name. It had become a pause amid the text, reminding us that some languages don't need translation, only recognition. The letter arrived one late afternoon, sent via intrastate mail, stamped from the new sheriff's office. No long title, no legal attachment, no press release, just a handwritten page in blue ink, beginning, "I write, not as a law enforcement leader, but as someone who chose silence when I should have spoken." The apology followed without preamble. "I'm sorry for Echo's death, and for letting a dog who served the country die like some strange animal in the eyes of those in uniform." Reuben read the letter, folded it, and emotions were unreadable. He didn't call or reply. Instead, he retrieved a small wooden box from his drawer, opened it, and selected an old, slightly faded photo. Printed on matte paper with a rough white border, it carried no date or note. In it, Echo slept on grass, eyes closed, ears relaxed, body fully at ease. No chain, no leash, no wary gaze. Reuben placed the photo in an envelope and sent it back to the return address. No words. The recipient understood, if forgiveness is granted, it exists beyond language. When the photo reached the sheriff's office, their workspace fell silent. They passed it hand to hand, not from curiosity, but from seeing something never seen before. A creature who once kept humans safe, now given back the gift of safety. As a reminder, no chain, no guard, murmured a young officer. The sheriff nodded, eyes on the window where patrol cars rolled out. Guns, radios, vigilance. Then he whispered, "We're equipped to respond. It was trained to wait, and we killed it while it was doing its most correct action." The story, wrapped in that photo, traveled farther than any report. Echo's sleeping image was reprinted in the press, used in training sessions on situational response, and displayed in police break rooms as an unofficial symbol, the image of trust that once existed without needing protection. Many shared it online with this caption, "If a creature can sleep unchained in this era, the problem isn't IT, it's those who made that normal rare." At a law enforcement behavior reform conference, Echo's photo opened the session. No title, no commentary. The speaker said, "Before we dive into data, look closely. This is a creature that believed it wasn't seen as the enemy, even in silence." The room stayed silent. No laughter, no note-taking, just held that moment a few seconds after the image faded. As for Reuben, he did not appear in the media afterward. No statements, no comments on the apology letter. But he was seen more often in military parks, where old dogs relearned to walk, where young trainers taught sit, stay, lie down. He didn't interfere, he observed, then walked away, as if the photo had said what needed saying, and what mattered next wasn't repeating words but preserving behavior. This event didn't conclude with a summary. It closed with a silent question. How many acts of right were shot down simply because they made no sound? And if the system now knows how to listen, can it learn to interpret stillness as a signal deserving more respect than any slogan? The answer? Reuben didn't provide it. He left a photo. And sometimes a quiet image is the most lucid action of a lifetime. Reuben walked slowly down the old street, his worn military boots pressing on the bricks that had witnessed everything. A gentle breeze stirred the leafless trees and brushed the loose leash in his hand. A sandy-colored puppy followed beside him, its eyes watching each step as if every stride were a lesson. Different from Echo, could never be the same, but carrying a similar silence, as though the void was being passed on, not replaced. The street remained unchanged, the houses stoic, only memories echoing sharper beneath each brick. When they reached the intersection where it all began, a patrol car eased to the curb. A young officer stepped out, his gaze sweeping to Reuben, settling on the puppy, walking calmly, unchained, only with a light leash. He seemed about to speak, maybe a reminder, maybe a question, but hesitated. His entire body froze mid-breath. He met Reuben's eyes, then lowered his head. Not from fear, not because he had to, but because he understood that some wounds were made in the very place he now stood, and that was a signal that some tattoos might move someone else on their minds. Reuben didn't react. He simply nodded once. No smile, no slowing down. That gesture wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't affirmation. It was simply a signal. I see, you understand. And that was enough. The officer stayed still a moment longer, perhaps searching for clarity, then returned to his car. No notebook, no call, no leaving his eyes from the long shadow of the man disappearing around the corner. At the base of the old stairway where an elderly woman sold pastries, Reuben paused. He unclipped the leash, letting the puppy sit beside him. A neighborhood boy ran up and pointed. "What's its name?" Reuben replied softly. "It doesn't have one yet. I'm waiting for it to teach me." The words weren't philosophical. They were, a dog, given time and the right space, will teach a person how to live in silence without defense. The grocery store window across the street, the old slogan remained, "He didn't move," and you shot. Everyone knows now it's no longer just about Echo, but about choice, about those who rushed to shoot empty space because they couldn't understand it. Reuben walked past without stopping, because what needed preserving no longer sat on the glass, but lived in the deliberate pause of those who once were ready to act. Back in the small alley where sunlight slanted between brick walls, Reuben removed the leash from the puppy completely. It stood still. No flinching, no barking, simply looking at him with bright, quiet eyes. He looked back, then took a few steps. The puppy followed. No command, no signal, just a shared understanding and an unspoken passing of trust. To an outsider, that moment seemed ordinary. But to those who knew of Echo, of what happened, of what it means to stand still and hold the line, this moment proved that sometimes what matters isn't the dog or the name, but whether the one leading it has learned to move forward without losing what matters most. And so, Reuben walked through the neighborhood that had once drowned him in shouting, live streams, anger, and regret, now moving as if he had just seen off a piece of the past at its final bus stop. He said nothing. He didn't look back. He simply kept walking, bringing the puppy alongside him with a pace that was neither hurried nor bound, the walk of someone who understood that some things cannot be replaced, but still need to be continued. The sentence wasn't loud, nor was it said with tension, but it silenced the tiled courtyard as if all sound had been pulled into its final words. Just don't repeat it. The young officer froze, file still in hand, not yet submitted. He had practiced saying "I'm sorry" hundreds of times in the mirror, imagining how to ease the tension if he ever met the man face to face, but in that moment, every script disappeared. Because no one prepares for a forgiveness that doesn't scold, but simply reminds with clarity and restraint, like a veteran pointing at a map and issuing a command, "From here, don't go back." Reuben didn't stop. He passed the old row of houses, eyes steady, shoulders not drawn back. Each step left no visible mark, but somehow everyone walking behind felt themselves slowing, treading lighter, as if they had no right to pass through someone's past without a moment of respect. A boy on the sidewalk watched his figure fade and asked his mother, why didn't he wave goodbye? She held his hand and replied gently, because he's gone far enough that he doesn't need to look back anymore. The answer wasn't sad. It explained a gait free of burden, one of someone who had lost, who had waited, and now chose to move on without owing anger any more space. The puppy kept stride beside him, not pulled, not out of sync. It seemed to understand that today's walk wasn't about destination, but about maintaining the right distance, close enough to walk together, never ahead, never behind. Just as Echo had once held formation in missions no one dared document in full. At a stone wall carved with veterans' names, Reuben paused for just 1 second, not to read, not to mourn, just as someone might catch their breath. Then he walked on, because sometimes the deepest respect isn't shown through special gestures, but in not disturbing what has already been lost. Some recognized him, but no one called out. They only nodded slightly, a reflex for someone who had endured the unnamed thing society talks too much about but understands too little. An old woman on a balcony watched him, pressed her lips together and turned inside. She didn't wave. But when the window closed, an old dog collar could be seen hanging behind the glass, to remind that memory doesn't need to be shouted, only placed in the right spot. Reuben crossed the pedestrian line, sunlight slanting across his shoulder. No officers stopped him. No one asked for papers. No one made a comment. The patrol on the opposite side looked away, not out of shame, but because they had been taught, or just learned, that some checks cost people something that can never be fixed. At the end of the street, a child ran past with a small dog. It barked once or twice, then sat, waiting. Reuben looked at it, then at the child, saying nothing. But in that second, his eyes no longer reflected just the past. They held something level, like soil newly seeded after a season of fire. He kept walking, posture steady, back straight, eyes forward, and Echo, though gone, still seemed to walk beside him, not in body, but in the presence that once taught people that loyalty is not submission, and staying still is not surrender. When the man turned down another street, no one behind him spoke. because everything that needed saying had been left in one sentence, and everything that needed remembering followed his steps. No glance back required. The moderator didn't react right away. Reuben's answer carried no flourish, offered no specific examples, yet it plunged the room into a strange stillness, as if everyone was reflecting on moments when they chose to shout instead of pausing. In that hall, filled mostly with military officers, veterans, and strategy researchers, the silence was not politeness but realization. That statement wasn't theory. It was the hard-earned conclusion of someone who'd protected others for years without drawing a weapon. A young officer asked next, voice low, as if not to break the quiet, "How do you wield that kind of power without making noise?" Reuben didn't look at him. He reached into his shirt pocket and placed a small object on the table. It was Echo's collar, now encased in thin steel, etched with a terse inscription. He sat, and they fired. We all heard it. No one needed him to explain. That line carried the weight of a tragedy, a trial, a society that punished a righteous act simply because it happened in silence. Reuben quietly recounted one time in Mosul when he and Echo were trapped in a collapsed building, where shouting meant death. Echo stayed still so long that Reuben thought it had stopped breathing, but its silence saved the unit behind them from revealing the ambush on the second floor. "I learned leadership from a dog that couldn't speak," Reuben said, "and I realized most of us shout because we fear we don't have the weight to be heard." Some took notes. Others paused mid-pen stroke. An older veteran nodded slowly, confirming the truth in those words. The moderator closed the session by asking to keep the collar for temporary display in a training program. Reuben agreed, needing no paperwork, no signature. He only said, "Just don't let it stay in a glass case." He knew some symbols, if only displayed, die a second death. After the session, Reuben's words, "A man who doesn't shout yet stops the shooting," spread widely. They became a theme in tactical training, written on whiteboards, remembered as an unofficial guiding principle. But more importantly, they prompted young trainees to ask, "If I need to shout to control, have I already lost control?" Reuben returned to the back row where he'd left his coat. In its pocket was a small copy of Echo's collar, not for display, but to carry. Because what matters is not an ID tag or viral clip, but the reminder that silence, when chosen at the right moment, is the act of someone who understands that power isn't in volume. On his way home, Reuben received a message from a lieutenant who'd attended, "Today I ordered a stop to a search because my men were raising voices at civilians. Thank you, I think I just stopped the shooting." Reuben didn't reply. He simply deleted it, as one might erase something completed needing no credit. At his desk at home, a faded photo of Echo still lay in the middle of an open book. No shrine needed, no rewrite. Sometimes, a silent act alone can change how an entire force perceives behavior. And if anyone asks what the difference is between reaction and choice, the answer isn't in words. It's in how Reuben passed through an entire system without shouting, but forced it to stop. In Reuben's pocket, the well-worn collar wrapped in steel lay close to his heart like an unofficial badge. The inscriptions, "He sat, and they fired. We all heard it," isn't ornate. It's the only report Reuben brought home from the battlefield to civilian life, from personal justice to a system no one oversees fully. Every time his fingers brushed that cold steel, he remembered that some deaths don't sound like gunfire. They come from the silence left behind. Reuben has no need for further explanation. He fought where screams were distractions, commands were silent gestures, and a dog could hold a formation because it knew when to stand and when not to move. To him, a system only truly works when it can hear what isn't said. Not slogans, not banners, but the pause, the unspoken gaze, the dog that sat and was shot, not because it was wrong, but because people didn't know how to understand its silence. Since the workshop, he hasn't spoken again. Yet that collar began to be reproduced. Metal replicas appeared in tactical training sessions, hung in canine training offices, posted on bulletin boards at police stations, and passed among young officers as an unofficial symbol. People stopped asking, "Who is Echo?" and started asking each other, "If it sits, would I still pull the trigger?" In a newly established class at a military academy, The teacher's opening question wasn't about tactics, but when have you been silent when you should have listened? No one answered immediately. Then a cadet stood, recounting how he once ignored an older man sitting on the curb, thinking he was in the way, only later realizing the man was the father of a fallen comrade. The story had no tragic end, but it underscored this: silence, when unheard, becomes proof of loss. Reuben resumed his morning walks out of habit. The puppy walked beside him, no commands, no cues. On its chest was a tiny metal tag, not for a name, but to remind that it carried something that once existed. Nobody asked for his autograph or snapped photos anymore. But when Reuben passed by, conversations halted. His presence was a language needing no translation, a structured, weighted pause, far more powerful than any loud slogan. If anyone asked Reuben what he carried from those years, he'd say nothing about medals, missions, or memories. He'd reach into his pocket, place the steel collar on a table, and quietly wait for the other person to read it. If they didn't understand, he wouldn't add another word, because not his job to repeat what he's already said. It's the system's job to learn how to read the truth when it's not shouted. Since then, in places that once sparked mistakes, cameras have been installed not to surveil but to record wordless moments. Schools instruct teachers to pause for 3 seconds after each question so students can think before responding. Police are trained to see that standing still is not resistance. Echo's collar became a symbol, not because it encircled an animal's neck, but because it held a silence that made a nation listen. And if the system learned this, not through orders, but through responding to stillness, then perhaps no one would die without anyone asking, why didn't they scream? Because sometimes the only thing missing from justice is ears alert enough to hear what wasn't said. If so, that steel collar is no longer a relic. It's the final reminder of a lesson paid for far too dearly to forget. The incident spread like wildfire without wind. The clip of Echo sitting still and being shot was clipped, shared, dissected, but what held everyone's attention wasn't the shot itself, but how Reuben stared down the man who pulled the trigger and said, "You're both dead men. Not in the sense I killed you, but in the sense this society won't forgive you. No threats, no warnings, just a cold verdict on a chain of actions with irreversible consequence." From then on, the story was no longer about one black man and a dog. It became a symbol. Echo ceased to be called an animal and was referred to as a comrade denied the right to exist. His collar was displayed in the Memorial for Unknown Soldiers. Laws were amended to recognize military service animals as living witnesses. Police academies added training in silent control. Children's classrooms discussed what makes a creature that doesn't need to bark still deserve to live. And the unanimous, simple answer, because it knows how to stand still. Reuben didn't speak to the media again. He refused to be the face of any campaign, declined all TV interviews. Instead, he resumed his morning walks with a new puppy, not a replacement for Echo, no name given, just quietly walking together. People stopped when they saw him pass by, not because he was famous, but because they'd learned a deeper lesson. Some silences aren't retreat. They're a last stand of dignity in a world full of noise. Reuben Shaw's story isn't a standalone tragedy. It's a silent warning. Every system, no matter how powerful, if it can't hear what's unspoken, will kill what's right, simply because it makes no sound. Everyone, from police to civilians, needs to relearn a lost skill, the ability to pause before a harmless creature, the ability to distinguish silence from threat, the ability to understand that absence of noise doesn't mean absence of value. If anyone asks what makes Reuben Shaw someone worth listening to despite never shouting, the answer doesn't lie in medals or honors. It lies in his stillness, letting society confront itself through the death of a dog that in truth was the death of a belief they didn't realize they'd had. And if we preserve that lesson, Echo never truly left. He just walks alongside us now in a different form of justice, silent but never absent.